The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Thomas Brennan, a 52-year-old civil engineer who designed water systems across 3 states, read it twice before the audacity truly registered. The Lakeside Estates HOA was demanding, not requesting, demanding, that he surrender a 15-foot easement of his private shoreline for community beach access. They cited bylaws that didn't apply to his property. They referenced covenants he'd never signed. And they gave him 14 days to comply or face daily fines of $500. Thomas set the letter down on his deck overlooking Mirror Lake, the massive reservoir he'd helped survey 30 years ago, and smiled. These people had no idea who they were threatening. They didn't know that the tired engineer sipping coffee on his dock wasn't just another lakefront homeowner. He was the man who literally controlled their water. But in 2 weeks, they were going to learn exactly what happened when you tried to bully someone who owned the damn charter. Before we get into how Thomas taught an entire HOA board the meaning of water rights, if you love stories where entitled people discover they've picked the absolute wrong fight, smash that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a quiet professional past his breaking point, the confrontation where an HOA board discovered they'd threatened the one person who held all the power, and the resolution where justice flowed as steadily as the water they'd taken for granted. Thomas Brennan had spent 3 decades as one of the most respected hydraulic engineers in the region, working on dam safety, water rights, and reservoir management. When he'd purchased the old surveyor's cabin on Mirror Lake 5 years ago, the same lake he'd helped create, he'd done so for peace and solitude. The property predated the HOA by 40 years. His deed included riparian rights that couldn't be superseded. But the new HOA board, led by a real estate developer named Patricia Vandermeer who'd bought in just 18 months ago, had decided that laws didn't apply to them. They wanted his shore. They wanted his dock. And they were willing to lie, intimidate, and threaten to get it. What they didn't understand was that Thomas didn't just live on this lake. He was the charter holder for the dam that created it. The confrontation would be surgical and devastating. When Thomas invited the HOA board to an emergency meeting at his property, they arrived expecting a surrender. Instead, they walked into a presentation that included original survey maps, water rights documentation, and the dam operations charter that Thomas had inherited from his mentor. Every entitled smirk disappeared when he explained that not only did they have 0 legal claim to his property, but that he had complete authority over the lake's water levels. The power dynamic didn't just shift, it inverted completely. And the ultimatum Thomas delivered made it crystal clear that they just threatened the one person who could drain their paradise. The resolution would be as cold and precise as the engineering calculations Thomas had built his career on. Within 72 hours, the HOA board learned what real consequences looked like when lakefront property values dropped. Boat docks sat exposed on mud flats, and their attorney confirmed that, yes, Thomas Brennan had every legal right to do exactly what he'd done. The justice wasn't just served. It was measured in feet of missing waterline and thousands of dollars in lost property value. Here's exactly how it happened. Thomas Brennan had earned his peace. At 52, the civil engineer had spent 30 years working on dam safety projects, reservoir management, and water rights disputes across the western United States. He'd testified before state water boards. He'd designed fail-safe systems for municipalities. He'd even served as an expert witness in federal water rights cases. When his mentor, Dr. Edwin Hartley, passed away 5 years ago and left him the old surveyor's cabin on Mirror Lake, Thomas saw it as a gift beyond measure. The property sat on 2 acres of pristine shoreline on the reservoir's western edge, accessible by a private road that predated the housing development by decades. The cabin itself was modest, but the location was priceless, tucked into a cove with a private dock, surrounded by old-growth pines, and far enough from the development to feel like wilderness. What made it truly special was the history. Dr. Hartley had been the lead surveyor when Mirror Lake was created in 1978, and this cabin had served as the operations base during construction. Thomas had worked as Hartley's assistant on that very project, fresh out of graduate school. The property came with something else, too, the Dam Operations Charter, a legal document that gave the holder authority over water level management within certain parameters. It was a relic from the original construction agreement, maintained for engineering oversight. Thomas kept it in a fireproof safe, along with the original survey maps and his deed. The trouble started 4 months ago when Patricia Vandermeer took over as HOA president. Vandermeer was a real estate developer from Phoenix who'd purchased a lakefront McMansion in Lakeside Estates 18 months prior. She was 51, carried herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd bulldozed through opposition her entire career, and had immediately begun modernizing the HOA's approach, which mostly meant finding new ways to assert control and generate revenue. Her first initiative was demanding that all lakefront properties contribute to a community beach fund, despite the fact that every property had private water access. When most homeowners refused, she shifted tactics. She wanted actual shoreline. Specifically, she wanted Thomas's shoreline. The first letter arrived in July, just after the 4th. It was professionally formatted on HOA letterhead, signed by Vandermeer and 2 board members Thomas had never met. The letter reminded him that as part of Lakeside Estates, he was required to comply with updated easement regulations that mandated a 10-foot setback from the waterline for community access corridors. Thomas read it once, noted that his property predated their HOA by 4 decades, and filed it away. He'd dealt with enough bureaucratic overreach in his career to recognize a hollow threat. 3 weeks later, the second letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. It claimed that Thomas was in violation of community standards by maintaining a private dock that restricted public enjoyment of the lake. It demanded he remove the dock within 30 days or face fines. Thomas called the HOA office that afternoon. The conversation with Vandermeer lasted less than 5 minutes. She spoke over him repeatedly, insisted that everyone has to follow the rules, and dismissed his explanation that his property wasn't part of their jurisdiction with a laugh that dripped with condescension. When Thomas mentioned that his deed predated their covenants, she replied, "That's not how it works anymore, Mr. Brennan. Times change. Either comply or we'll take legal action." Then she hung up. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late August. Thomas was working in his garden when he heard vehicles on his private access road. 3 cars pulled into his driveway, Vandermeer's white Lexus SUV and 2 trucks carrying work crews. Vandermeer emerged wearing designer sunglasses and holding a clipboard. She walked directly toward his shore without knocking on his door. Thomas intercepted her halfway across his lawn. The conversation was brief and infuriating. Vandermeer informed him that since he'd refused to cooperate, the HOA was exercising emergency easement rights to begin construction of a community access point. When Thomas told her she was trespassing, she smiled and said, "Sue us. By the time you get a court date, it'll be done." The work crews began unloading materials. Thomas pulled out his phone and called the county sheriff. The deputies who arrived 40 minutes later were sympathetic but limited in immediate action. They confirmed it was a civil property dispute and suggested Thomas contact an attorney. Vandermeer stood on his dock the entire time, arms crossed, watching. As the sheriff's vehicles left, she turned to Thomas and said loud enough for her crews to hear, "You had your chance to do this the easy way." That night, Thomas sat in his cabin with a glass of bourbon and made a decision. He'd spent his entire career working within systems, following regulations, respecting process. He'd tried reason. He'd tried explanation. These people weren't interested in either. They thought they could intimidate him because he was quiet. They assumed his lack of aggression meant weakness. What they didn't understand was that silence in an engineer often meant calculation. And Thomas had just finished calculating exactly how to teach them what real power looked like. He retrieved the Dam Operations Charter from his safe. He pulled up the reservoir management protocols on his laptop, and he began drafting a very specific plan. If Patricia Vandermeer wanted to play games with water rights, Thomas would show her what happened when you threatened someone who controlled the water itself. The certified letter arrived 3 days later, the one demanding the 15-foot easement with 14 days to comply. Thomas read it twice, smiled, and began making phone calls. Everything was finally ready. The email Thomas sent to the HOA board on Friday afternoon was professionally worded and deceptively simple. He requested an emergency meeting at his property the following Monday at 10 a.m. to discuss water rights documentation relevant to recent demands. He copied the HOA's attorney. He included a single attachment, a scanned copy of the original 1978 Mirror Lake survey map with his property clearly marked as the operations base. The response from Vandermeer came within an hour, dripping with barely concealed triumph. She confirmed attendance and noted that she'd bring legal representation to witness your compliance agreement. Thomas smiled when he read it. She thought he was surrendering. Monday morning broke clear and warm, the lake's surface like glass. Thomas set up a folding table on his deck with a laptop, a projector aimed at his cabin's exterior wall, and 3 stacks of documents in archival boxes. He wore khakis and a pressed button-down shirt, the same professional attire he'd worn to countless engineering presentations. At 9:55, the vehicles arrived. Vandermeer brought 5 people, 2 board members Thomas recognized from community meetings, the HOA's attorney, and 2 others who appeared to be potential buyers she was courting for adjacent lots. They emerged from their cars wearing expressions ranging from smug satisfaction to bored obligation. Vandermeer led the group across his lawn like she owned it, her heels sinking into the grass. She didn't greet Thomas. She simply said, "Let's make this quick. We have a contractor starting demolition on your dock next week, and I'd prefer not to involve law enforcement." Thomas gestured to the folding chairs he'd arranged. "Please sit. This will take about 20 minutes. The attorney, a thin man named Douglas Chen, frowned. "Mr. Brennan, if you've called us here to negotiate the easement terms—" "I've called you here," Thomas interrupted quietly, "to provide documentation that will prevent your client from committing actionable trespass, property damage, and fraud. Now please sit down." Something in his tone made them comply. Thomas opened his laptop, and the projector flickered to life, displaying the 1978 survey map in crisp detail. He began speaking in the calm, methodical voice he'd used in courtrooms and boardrooms for 3 decades. "Mirror Lake is a man-made reservoir created in 1978 by the damming of Cedar Creek. I was part of the original survey team under Dr. Edwin Hartley. This property," he pointed to the screen, "served as the operational base during construction. It was deeded to Dr. Hartley as part of his compensation package with specific riparian rights that supersede any subsequent development covenants." He clicked to the next slide, his property deed highlighted and annotated. "As you can see, my deed is dated November 1978. Lakeside Estates wasn't developed until 2001. My property exists outside your jurisdiction." Vandermeer waved dismissively. "Adjoining properties still have to comply with Mrs. Vandermeer," Thomas said, and something in his voice made her stop. "I'm going to explain something once. Please don't interrupt again." He clicked to the next document. The room went very quiet. Displayed on his cabin wall was the official dam operations charter, sealed and notarized, with Thomas Brennan listed as the current charter holder. "This document," Thomas continued, "grants the holder authority over water level management for Mirror Lake within operational parameters set by the State Water Board. Dr. Hartley held this charter from 1978 until his death. He transferred it to me along with this property. I've maintained it as part of my professional responsibilities." The attorney leaned forward suddenly, his face pale. "You control the dam?" "I hold the operational charter, yes. I can adjust water levels within a 6-foot range for maintenance, safety, and engineering purposes. I'm required to provide notice to the state board and adjacent property owners. I fulfilled both requirements this morning." Thomas pulled up an email on his screen, timestamped 6 a.m., sent to the State Water Management Office and copied to every property owner in Lakeside Estates. "As of noon today, I'm implementing a seasonal drawdown of 4 feet for dam maintenance and safety inspection. Duration, 60 days with possible extension." The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. Then Vandermeer laughed, but it sounded forced. "You can't do that. Our docks, the property values, are about to be significantly impacted." "Yes," Thomas agreed. He clicked to a photograph of the lake at current levels, then to a simulation showing what 4 feet of drawdown would look like. Every dock in the development would be sitting on mud. The swimming area would be exposed rock and muck. The pristine waterfront views would become barren shoreline. Board member David Phelps, a retired accountant, found his voice. "This is, you can't do this out of spite." "I'm not," Thomas replied calmly. I'm conducting legitimate dam safety inspections that are overdue by state requirements. The fact that I'm doing so now, after your organization has repeatedly trespassed on my property, threatened me with fraudulent legal action, and attempted to seize my private land through intimidation. That's simply unfortunate timing. He turned to face Vandermeer directly. You have two options, Mrs. Vandermeer. Option 1, you withdraw all demands regarding my property immediately. You provide written confirmation that my land is not subject to your HOA's jurisdiction. You issue a formal apology for the trespass and threats. You never contact me again except for legitimate community notices. If you do this within 24 hours, I'll cancel the drawdown and site equipment calibration as the reason. He paused. Option 2, you continue on your current path. The drawdown proceeds, your property values tank, your residents sue the HOA for mismanagement. And when you inevitably try to take legal action against me, my attorney, who specializes in water rights law, will be happy to countersue for harassment, trespass, and attempted property theft. We'll depose every board member. We'll audit your finances. And we'll make sure every property owner in your development knows exactly who's responsible for their docks sitting in mud. Douglas Chen, the attorney, was frantically typing on his phone. He looked up at Vandermeer with barely concealed panic. He can do this. The charter is legitimate. We have no standing to. I don't care. Vandermeer's composure finally cracked. This is blackmail. No, Thomas corrected. This is water rights law, something you should have researched before threatening a hydraulic engineer on his own property. He closed his laptop. You have until 10 a.m. tomorrow. The drawdown sequence begins at noon. Choose wisely. They sat frozen for a moment, the implications crashing over them like a wave. Finally, Vandermeer stood abruptly, her face flushed. This isn't over. Thomas smiled for the first time. Actually, Mrs. Vandermeer, I think you'll find it is. Because if you're still HOA president this time tomorrow, every property owner in Lakeside Estates is going to be asking why their $10 million view turned into a mud flat. And the answer will be, because you tried to steal land from the one person who controls your water. They left in angry, frightened silence. Thomas watched their vehicles disappear down his access road, then turned to look at his lake, still pristine, still full, still his. He had every intention of following through, but something told him he wouldn't have to. The email arrived at 9:47 a.m. the next morning, 13 minutes before Thomas's deadline. It came from Douglas Chen, the HOA attorney, and was copied to every board member plus the development's property management company. The subject line read, "Immediate withdrawal of all property claims, T. Brennan." The message was brief and professional, stating that upon review of historical property records and relevant water rights documentation, the HOA acknowledged that Thomas Brennan's property existed outside their jurisdiction. All previous demands were rescinded. A formal letter would follow. There was no apology. Thomas hadn't really expected one. He opened his email to the State Water Board and typed a short message explaining that equipment calibration had revealed the drawdown was unnecessary at this time. Maintenance inspection would be rescheduled. He hit send, made himself coffee, and went out to his dock. The formal letter arrived by courier that afternoon, signed by the entire board. It was stilted and clearly written by their attorney, but it confirmed everything Thomas had demanded. His property was officially recognized as pre-existing the HOA. His riparian rights were acknowledged. All easement demands were permanently withdrawn. At the bottom, in what appeared to be a handwritten addition, was a single line. The board apologizes for any misunderstanding regarding property boundaries. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thomas filed it with his other documents. The real resolution, though, came over the following weeks through the community grapevine. Thomas didn't seek out gossip, but the lake was a small world and word traveled fast. Within 3 days of the confrontation, every property owner in Lakeside Estates had learned about the near disaster. The story spread with variations, but the core remained consistent. Their HOA president had nearly tanked everyone's property values by threatening the man who controlled the dam. The backlash was immediate and severe. Property owners who'd been ambivalent about Vandermeer's aggressive management style suddenly became vocal critics. The Facebook group for Lakeside Estates exploded with angry posts demanding explanation and accountability. Several homeowners discovered that Vandermeer had been planning to develop the community beach. She'd wanted Thomas's land for into a private event venue rental to generate HOA revenue that would have primarily benefited her property management company. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Saturday. Thomas didn't attend, but his neighbor, a retired teacher named Margaret Stokes, filled him in afterward over coffee. Vandermeer had tried to control the narrative, claiming Thomas had threatened the community with his drawdown. It backfired spectacularly when 3 property owners who'd done their research stood up with printed copies of the dam charter regulations, explaining that Thomas had every legal right to do exactly what he'd threatened. Another homeowner, an attorney specializing in real estate, pointed out that Vandermeer's actions could have exposed the HOA to massive liability. The meeting ended with a vote of no confidence. Vandermeer resigned as president effective immediately. 2 board members who'd supported her resigned as well. The new interim board's first action was sending Thomas a fruit basket and a personal letter, actually personal this time, apologizing for the harassment and thanking him for his restraint. Thomas ran into David Phelps, the retired accountant from the board, at the hardware store 2 weeks later. Phelps approached cautiously, hands visible, like someone approaching a dog that had previously bitten. "Mr. Brennan, I wanted to apologize personally. We should have looked into the property history before." "You should have," Thomas agreed, but his tone wasn't harsh. "But I understand how it happens. Someone confident makes claims, and people assume they've done the research." Phelps nodded gratefully. "Patricia's listed her house. Word is she's moving back to Phoenix." "Probably for the best," Thomas said. "How's the new board?" "Much more careful," Phelps replied with a slight smile. "We've actually started verifying things before sending letters now. Imagine that." They shook hands, and Thomas meant it when he wished Phelps well. The most satisfying moment came on a Sunday morning 6 weeks after the confrontation. Thomas was on his dock at dawn, coffee in hand, watching mist rise off the lake's surface. The water was glass smooth, 4 feet higher than it had been during his threatened drawdown. His private shore was exactly as it had always been, quiet, pristine, undisturbed. A blue heron landed on the far end of his dock, regarding him with prehistoric patience before taking off across the water. Thomas thought about Dr. Hartley, about the summer they'd spent surveying this valley before it became a lake, about how his mentor had always said that good engineering wasn't about power. It was about understanding systems well enough to prevent disasters before they happened. Thomas had prevented a disaster, both for himself and for the 200 families who'd nearly seen their property values collapse because their HOA president had picked a fight with the wrong man. He heard footsteps on his deck and turned to see his daughter, Emma, and his grandson, Jack, emerging from the cabin. They'd driven up from Sacramento for the weekend, a regular visit but especially welcome after the chaos. Jack, 8 years old and fearless, ran straight to the dock. "Grandpa, can we take the kayaks out?" "After breakfast," Thomas replied, pulling the boy into a hug. Emma joined them, coffee mug in hand, settling into the Adirondack chair next to his. "Dad, Margaret told me what happened with the HOA, the whole story," Thomas shrugged. "It wasn't that dramatic. You threatened to drain the lake." "I threatened to lower it 4 feet for legitimate maintenance purposes," Emma laughed. "You scared them so badly their president resigned." "She scared herself," Thomas corrected. "I just showed her the truth about who had power in this situation. Sometimes bullies need to learn that loud doesn't mean strong and quiet doesn't mean weak. Besides, I never actually lowered the water." "But you would have," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Thomas looked out at his lake, at the pristine surface that reflected the morning sky, at the shore he'd fought to protect not out of spite but out of principle. "Yes," he said finally, "I would have, because this land is mine, the peace here is mine, and I've spent too many years working too hard to let someone take it because they thought I was too tired to fight back." He smiled. "But I'm glad I didn't have to. Engineering is always better when you solve problems without breaking systems." They sat in comfortable silence, 3 generations watching the sun burn through the mist. Patricia Vandermeer was gone. The HOA had learned humility. Thomas's property was secure, his rights acknowledged, his peace restored. He'd learned something, too, that sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or lawyers or dramatic public confrontations. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly how systems work, exactly where the power lies, and exactly how to make people understand that their assumptions about who holds leverage are dangerously wrong. And as Thomas sat there watching his grandson skip rocks across his private lake, he smiled. Because justice, whether delivered hot or cold, with drama or with quiet precision, was equally satisfying when it protected what mattered most. Across the country in Savannah, Georgia, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Diana Osai was reading a certified letter from her condo association, demanding she remove her unauthorized vegetable garden from her top-floor terrace. Diana, 63 years old and a decorated logistics expert who'd managed supply chains for 3 continents, smiled slowly as she pulled out the original building blueprints, the ones showing the rooftop garden provisions she'd specifically required as part of her purchase contract 14 years ago. She dialed the association president's number, and when he answered, her voice carried the same calm authority that had once directed airlifts during humanitarian crises. You have 60 seconds to withdraw your demand before I file documentation proving your board has been in breach of my contract for 6 months. I've been keeping excellent records. The silence on the other end was gratifying, but that's a story for another time.